So as I said, we started an organization to focus public attention on emerging privacy and civil liberties issues about 25 years ago. We have a wide range of policy interests reflected in this word cloud, which is frankly much easier to write than an annual report. You'll notice in the upper left corner, one of our key themes these days is algorithmic transparency. Now let me explain to you, we have no objection, of course, to the delivery of government services using AI techniques, but if you think about it for a moment, many of the debates around the deployment of AI techniques today resemble the debates associated with the use of computing technology in government agencies back in the 1960s and 1970s. And in fact, Congress did a very good job at that time with the insight of lawyers and technologists and public advocates and others in trying to craft a policy framework that enabled the adoption of automation techniques while simultaneously trying to safeguard privacy and fairness in government record-keeping systems. That's how we got the Privacy Act of 1974, which many states, of course, have followed. Now, it's always been my view that the core interest in the protection of privacy is not so much about secrecy or confidentiality, which is how we typically use that word. It's about the fairness of the processing concerning the data of the individual. Is this the right person? Does it reflect all the relevant criteria? Is it accurate and up to date? Have they been given an opportunity to challenge adverse determinations? All of these considerations, in fact, were considered by the Congress back in the early 1970s when it said simultaneously, yes, let's adopt computing technology to make government services more efficient, but let's simultaneously ensure that we have adequate safeguards to protect the interests of the individual. And it's this particular debate that we are hoping to carry forward in the current discussion over AI. Part of the problem, of course, is that as these systems have become more sophisticated, they have become more opaque. And I have discussions nowadays with very smart computer scientists, and I say, well, how are we going to implement algorithmic transparency? And they said to me, well, you don't understand machine learning or neural networks. You see, because in these complex systems, we actually don't know how the outputs are produced. We can't replicate them. I typically pause and I say, how do you feel about that? I mean, as a scientist, how do you feel about that? I remember being taught that one of the keys to the scientific method was the ability to replicate outcomes. We are literally creating today black boxes over which outcomes are produced, and the people who are responsible for these systems, including the engineers, say in effect, I'm okay if I can't prove results. These systems are widespread, and they have enormous impact on the lives of individuals. Everything from the admission to a university like this one, to employment, to housing, insurance, commerce, even access to knowledge. The way information is presented on the internet to individuals is determined by algorithms that reflect aspects that is known to the search company about that particular individual. And what you may see in response to a search query is not necessarily what someone else may see in response to a search query. So this is in effect to show you how opportunities are in fact lost to individuals through the use of such systems. I was astounded, actually, in the numerous privacy campaigns and lawsuits that we have pursued over the years, that even some of the most sophisticated organizations in the world themselves couldn't understand and assess how their techniques were being deployed. And this came out in the post-Snowden evaluation of the NSA surveillance techniques. And if you read carefully some of the judicial opinions in the exchange between the agency and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, one of the things you will find is the NSA conceding that they didn't know that some of their systems had the ability to gain access to the information that they were in fact collecting, which I think should maybe give us all pause as we think about the deployment of these systems. Well, I thought a lot about how to convey what I see as the central concern in this realm. And I think it is about transparency. I think it is about the right of individuals to know how automated decisions are made about them. And we have spent the last 5 years actually bringing a series of cases involving federal agencies and even the US Federal Trade Commission, asking, for example, how does the TSA decide to pick a person out of a line for secondary screening? Do you use nationality as a factor? Do you use gender? Do you use race? Do you use religious belief? Some of those factors are actually not permissible in the United States because we recognize that when our government discriminates against someone based on their religious views or their race, that's impermissible discrimination. But it's actually impossible to make that determination without access to the algorithm. The other thing which we're aware of through our litigation is that these systems have become very sophisticated. There was one time, by the way, I don't know if it's still going on, I suspect every person in this room had a rating of 0 to 1, which is a determination that the Department of Homeland Security had made regarding your likelihood to commit a terrorist act. And that rating contributed to a decision about whether or not you would be subject to additional inspection. I don't mean to sound Orwellian about all this. It was actually a resource scarcity problem. It was borrowed from the technique to evaluate the containers that were entering the United States. And the Department of Homeland Security said we can only open 1 of 20 containers given our ability to police the ports. We will look at a variety of factors in the manifest to decide which of every 20 containers to open, and then to port that technique over to individuals entering the United States to use similar factors to assign scores, and then to allocate resources to the greatest risk. It's not irrational. We have more recently actually looked at the spread of secret rating techniques in the private sector. I'm sorry, Governor, this may actually be a Brookline-based company called Universal Tennis Rating, which has developed a proprietary scoring technique for young athletes. Now, the purpose, I think, is quite reasonable. How do we take young athletes who play tennis in different regions of the country, participate with different leagues and different clubs, and match them up when they come together and assure that they're roughly equivalent skill. Now, in some sports, that's actually pretty easy. If we were talking about the mile, for example, we might say, well, if you can do a mile that's under 4 minutes and 30 seconds, you've qualified for this event. Turns out to be more difficult in sports such as tennis. Well, this company decided that the solution was to assign a rating to young athletes. It just wouldn't reveal the basis of the rating, the criteria, or the weighting. And we objected to that. We said there are actually other ways to solve this problem that don't require the use of secret techniques. Someone wrote a news story that said that we took a swing at secret tennis rating techniques. Okay. How do we talk about this in a way that the public understands? I will go a little bit more deeply in a moment to some of the policy options, but we have literally created screen cleaners, which we're going to leave with you, that say open the code, algorithmic transparency. Our theory is that you can't fix the code if you can't see the code. So we want people to look a little bit more closely at the code they're writing. We even have laptop stickers, Stop Discrimination by Computer and Secret Profiling, and the one that the geeks assured me was the most clever, although I don't still fully understand it. Bayesian determinations are not justice. Some of you are smiling, so I guess they were right. One of the other initiatives that we've undertaken, apart from the cases at Epic, is try to get the administration, which is now focused on the issue of AI in the US economy and AI in the US government, to create a public process that will enable public input into the policies that the United States produces. So the White House in May held a closed-door conference. They invited some business groups and agencies, and they created a select committee on AI, but there was no mechanism for public participation. We were actually surprised by that, because when President Obama undertook a similar initiative on big data, he was quite purposeful in trying to enable pathway so that the public could express its views. So we wrote a petition that was joined by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the ACM, the IEEE, most of the leading scientific societies in the United States, to the OSTP, and we urged public mechanisms for public participation on AI policy. And you see here at the beginning of our petition. By the way, it's still open for signature. If you're interested in this, this is something we're always trying to push forward. We've continued to raise this message with the United States Congress. We think algorithmic transparency will be key, as well as public participation in policy formulation. Now I want to turn to the sort of the deep policy part of this brief presentation. And that's the opportunity that I believe is presented at the OECD to pursue the governor's recommendation for a global accord. I was very pleased to see, in fact, that earlier this year, I believe you had the Secretary General here and gave him an award. He's done outstanding work both to promote policy process with many of the leading economic countries around the world and to encourage the participation of civil society. So we've brought many experts from academic and other communities to the OECD. The organization is also well known for the articulation of policy frameworks to address emerging challenges. These are typically 8 or 9 key principles followed by an explanatory text that member countries support and can then be translated into national law. The OECD itself has no legal authority, but these well-developed principles have oftentimes been adopted by countries around the world and have framed legal rights and responsibilities. Perhaps the most famous is the OECD Privacy Guidelines of 1981 that can be found in laws in the US and in Europe and Asia and elsewhere. But as you can see, they exist in other areas of IT policy. And the current initiative at the OECD is around artificial intelligence. And I would say perhaps the best articulation in the OECD discussion so far has, oh, well, that's my friend Garry Kasparov. So he's the world champion in chess, wrote a very good book recently on AI called Deep Thinking. He's also working in support of the OECD initiative. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is this set of principles that was put forward by the Japanese government in the context of AI policies for R&D, which have received a lot of interest, and consistent with the OECD guidelines, the Japanese government is looking to a set of simple principles that can be broadly understood and then implemented through law, through professional guidance, through industry standards. There is a positive vision in here. It is one of collaboration, but it is also one that recognizes risk and talks about transparency, controllability, safety, security, privacy, ethics, and then outreach to users, individuals, consumers, citizens who are ultimately impacted. The final point I want to make is, I think there is some urgency to this issue. I think for those of us who've been working in the field of technology policy, there's a sense almost that time is accelerating, that deployment takes place more quickly, and that the gap between informed government decision-making and the reality of our technology-driven world is increasing quickly, very quickly. And this gives rise to at least 2 concerns, and I want to leave these with you in addition to these really cool screen cleaners. The first is what we already know about the direction that the Chinese government is taking. And again, this is very rational. If you can gather lots and lots of data about individuals, you can rapidly automate processes, you can achieve new efficiencies, you can manage scarce resources, all of the things that government is constantly trying to do. What China is driving towards is a system where every single person has a number assigned, aligned with the interests of the government, and the benefits to the individual are proportional to the number. And joining the scoring system is the rapid expansion of data collection, because this is an unbounded technique. This is a story from just the past week. China's largest ride-hailing company, this is 90% of the market, by the way, is now recording in-car audio during passenger trips. The largest manufacturer of drones in the United States market is DJI, which is a Chinese firm, by the way. Now, if you're concerned that I'm sounding a little too nationalistic or anti-China, I actually have a warning, and this is my second warning to you, to the Chinese. I think the great risk here for all governments, even those governments that strive for efficiency within the boundaries of a constitutional democracy, is that they will ultimately lose control of these systems. And that is the warning for us from 2001. Highly advanced technology, wonderful ambition, but what was the ultimate consequence in that story? Sorry, Dave, I can't do that. I can't let you out of the pod bay. We'll come back at some point, I think, to how we understand Asimov's laws of robotics in our current era. But I do want to stress to you today how very important I believe it is to move forward on a project to establish algorithmic transparency and a set of framework principles for the deployment of AI that protects the interests of the individual. Thank you.